Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, and maybe drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. It started as a spontaneous plan. My friends and I were bored, and someone brought up the old Harrow Steel factory. It had been abandoned for years, a decaying relic just outside of town. The stories about it varied: fires, accidents, even murders. It was the perfect place to kill a Saturday night. 4 of us piled into my car. Jake, the loud one. Molly, who was always game for a thrill. Sarah, quieter but never one to back down. And me, the reluctant driver. By the time we reached the factory, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the chain-link fence. The fence was torn in places, so it wasn't hard to slip through. Inside, the factory was a maze of rusted beams, shattered windows, and graffiti-covered walls. The air smelled of mildew and iron. "Creepy enough for you?" Jake asked, his voice echoing unnervingly. We wandered through the first few rooms, our flashlights slicing through the thick darkness. The floors were covered in debris-broken tools, shards of glass, and scraps of metal. Molly picked up a rusted wrench, laughing. "I'll protect us," she said, waving it around. It didn't take long for the mood to shift. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed against us like a weight. Even Jake stopped making jokes. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered. We found what looked like an old break room. A few chairs were overturned, and a rotting couch sagged in the corner. A faded calendar on the wall still read June 1987. Molly shone her flashlight at it. "It's like a time capsule," she said. Jake opened a drawer in a rusted filing cabinet. "Hey, check this out," he called, pulling out a stack of papers. They were employee records, brittle and yellowed. "This guy worked here for 30 years, he said, showing us a photo of a man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. We moved on, stepping carefully through a hallway lined with broken machinery. The floor groaned under our weight. Somewhere in the distance, a metallic clang echoed. "Probably just the wind," Molly said, but her voice wavered. We came to a stairwell leading to the upper level. "Let's check it out," Jake said, already climbing. I hesitated, looking back down the hallway. I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but when I looked again, it was gone. "You coming?" Sarah asked. The upper level was worse. The floor was riddled with holes, and the walls seemed to close the further we walked. We found a room filled with dusty lockers. Most were empty, but one was slightly ajar. Molly reached out to open it. "Wait," I said, but she ignored me. The locker creaked open to reveal a bundle of cloth. Molly unwrapped it, revealing a hard hat with a name written on the side. B. Harrow. "Wasn't that the guy who owned this place?" Jake asked. None of us answered. The air felt heavier, like we weren't supposed to be there. Sarah found a journal wedged in another locker. Its pages were water-stained, but some entries were legible. They talked about long shifts, dangerous conditions, and a growing sense of dread among the workers. The last entry simply read, "He's watching us." "What does that mean?" Molly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged, but his usual bravado was gone. "Let's keep moving," I said, wanting to leave the room. The idea of being watched suddenly felt very real. We reached the end of the hallway, where a set of double doors led to the factory floor. Pushing them open revealed a vast, cavernous space filled with rusted conveyor belts and skeletal remains of machinery. Our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. As we stepped inside, the doors slammed shut behind us. Molly screamed, and we all turned back. but the doors wouldn't budge. "It's just the wind," Jake said, though his voice trembled. "We need to find another way out," I said, trying to stay calm. We walked toward the far end of the factory floor, our footsteps echoing unnervingly. Suddenly, Sarah stopped. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, straining to listen. A faint scraping sound came from somewhere above us. I shone my flashlight toward the ceiling, but the beam couldn't reach. The sound grew louder, like something heavy being dragged. Molly gripped my arm. "What is that?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. We picked up the pace, heading toward a set of stairs that led down. As we descended, the air grew colder. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a basement filled with rusted barrels and piles of debris. The scraping sound had stopped. Jake found a door, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. It was locked, but the wood was rotted. He kicked it open, revealing a smaller room lined with shelves. On one of the shelves sat a single lantern, its glass cracked but intact. Molly lit the lantern, and its glow revealed more details of the room. In the corner, a chair sat facing the wall. Chains were bolted to the floor beside it. "What the hell happened here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, we heard the scraping sound again. This time, it was coming from the hallway outside. "We need to go," I said, my voice firm. But as we turned to leave, the lantern flickered and went out. In the darkness, I heard Molly gasp. "Something's here," she whispered. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, but the beam only illuminated empty space. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. "Run," I said, and we bolted. We ran blindly through the basement, stumbling over debris. The sound followed us, relentless and unexplainable. Finally, we found a staircase leading back up. Jake shoved the door open, and we burst into the night air, gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. No one spoke as we sped away, the factory shrinking into the distance. It felt like we had barely escaped. The silence in the car was suffocating. Finally, Jake broke it. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice cracking. No one had an answer. Molly clutched the hard hat she had taken, her knuckles white. "We shouldn't have gone there," she whispered. When we dropped Sarah off, she refused to look back at the car. "I don't want to talk about this," she said before slamming the door. I couldn't blame her. None of us wanted to acknowledge what had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of the factory and the sounds we heard replayed in my mind. I kept imagining that chair in the basement, the chains, and the journal's final words. He's watching us. The next morning, Molly called. "The hard hat, it's gone," she said, her voice shaking. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I left it on my nightstand, and now it's not there," she said. I think it followed us." We agreed not to talk about it again, but I know none of us have forgotten. Even now, I feel like someone is watching. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that scraping sound, faint but unmistakable. I don't know what we disturbed in that factory. The one thing is certain, we were never supposed to be there. And now, I'm not sure we ever really left. Next story. I checked into the Lakeview Motel just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The neon sign flickered, casting uneven light across the cracked asphalt of the lot. Exhaustion from my cross-country drive pushed aside any apprehension about the motel's run-down appearance. I just needed a bed for the night and a lock on the door. The clerk behind the counter, a wiry man with tired eyes, slid a key across the desk. "Room 12. End of the row," he said, not bothering to meet my gaze. His monotone delivery made the interaction feel transactional. like I was just another passing shadow in the motel's history. Room 12 was small, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges and a bedspread that smelled faintly of detergent masking something older. I bolted the door, drew the curtains, and fell onto the bed without bothering to unpack. The creak of the mattress felt louder than it should in the otherwise silent night. I was nearly asleep when a soft tapping sound broke the stillness. It came from the wall adjacent to the bed. At first, I dismissed it as plumbing or the structure settling, but the sound grew more deliberate. Tap, pause, tap, pause. Someone or something was on the other side. Curiosity overcame exhaustion. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened, breathing, faint but unmistakable. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly, but there was no response. My pulse quickened. It was probably just another guest, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the unease. Determined to dismiss my paranoia, I lay back down. The tapping stopped. I closed my eyes, telling myself to get some sleep. But just as I was drifting off, the sound of a door creaking open outside jolted me upright. It was faint but distinct, and it was close. I moved to the window, peeking through the gap in the curtains. The parking lot was bathed in the weak glow of a flickering street lamp. A man stood near a car, motionless, his face obscured by shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there as if waiting. After a few moments, he turned and walked toward one of the rooms further down the row. I released a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe he was just another guest. But as he disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him wasn't right. The night grew quieter. I tried to sleep again, but the faint sound of footsteps echoed outside my door. I froze, every muscle tense. The steps stopped, replaced by a soft shuffling noise. Someone was at my door. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the front desk. No answer. "Great," I muttered under my breath. The shuffling noise stopped, and I thought maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then the doorknob rattled, sending a jolt of panic through me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. Silence. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and stood by the door, my heart hammering. After a few excruciating moments, the sound stopped. Whoever it was had left, or so I hoped. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I barely slept. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first rays of sunlight seeped through the curtains, I packed up my things, determined to check out and put the unnerving night behind me. At the front desk, I handed the key to the same tired-eyed clerk. "Busy night?" I asked, hoping for some explanation. He looked at me blankly. "Not really. Place was pretty quiet." I hesitated. "Are there cameras in the parking lot?" His frown deepened. "Cameras don't work," he admitted, almost like he didn't care. "Why? Something happened?" I shook my head, unwilling to sound paranoid. "Just curious," I lied. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of the registry book on the counter. Only one name was listed for last night. Mine. A chill ran through me. Were there other guests here? I asked, keeping my tone casual. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "No, you were the only one." My stomach twisted. That couldn't be right. "What about the man outside?" I pressed, my voice rising slightly. He walked toward one of the rooms. The clerk shrugged. "Probably someone passing through. People sometimes stop and leave without checking in." His answer didn't reassure me. I left the motel, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I pulled out of the lot. As I merged onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The road behind me was empty, but the unease lingered. Something didn't add up. The tapping, the footsteps, the man outside, none of it made sense. And the fact that I was supposedly the only guest that night left me with more questions than answers. I stopped at a diner a few miles down the road. hoping a hot meal would settle my nerves. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The memory of the man in the parking lot replayed in my mind. Then I noticed something on the back of my car when I returned. A smear of dirt on the trunk. It hadn't been there before. My heart raced as I inspected it. The streaks looked like handprints. Someone had been there. I opened the trunk, half expecting to find something or someone, but it was empty. Still, the handprints were unmistakable. Whoever had been at the motel had gotten closer than I realized. As I drove away from the diner, a thought struck me. What if the man had been in my room before I arrived? The tapping, the breathing, it all seemed too deliberate to be random. Had I narrowly avoided something worse? I decided to stop at a gas station to calm myself. While paying, I overheard the cashier talking to a local about the Lakeview Motel. Nobody stays there anymore. The local said, "It's bad luck." "Why's that?" I asked, unable to stop myself. The local looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "You're not from around here, are you? They say bad things happen there. People go missing." I left the gas station, my mind racing. Had I been a target? Or was I just unlucky to have stayed there? Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. The miles passed in a blur as I drove, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that motel. The faint feeling of being watched still lingered, though I told myself it was all in my head. I finally reached my destination, a small town where I planned to stay with friends. As I unpacked my things, I found something that made my blood run cold. A scrap of paper tucked into my bag. The paper had a single word scrawled on it. Lucky. I stared at it, my mind reeling. How had it gotten there? And what did it mean? The implications were terrifying. I showed it to my friends, but they laughed it off as a prank. "You probably forgot you put it there," one of them said. But I knew better. That word wasn't mine. Even now, I can't stop wondering who or what was watching me that night, and why was I deemed lucky? I'll never forget the unease I felt, and I haven't stayed in a roadside motel since. Next story. It started as a dare. The old Southside Mall had been abandoned for over a decade, and rumors of its dark history swirled through town. "You wouldn't last an hour inside," my friend Tom sneered. I hated backing down from a challenge, so I agreed, even though the idea gave me a strange sense of dread. The mall loomed ahead, its faded sign missing letters, casting strange shadows in the moonlight. The parking lot was a wasteland of broken glass and weeds. "You've got this," I muttered to myself, pulling out a flashlight. My footsteps echoed eerily as I approached the shattered main entrance. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. The beam of my flashlight swept across empty storefronts, their displays long gone. Graffiti covered the walls, but one phrase caught my attention: "Never alone." The words were scratched into the wall, not painted. I passed by what used to be a bookstore, the shelves now barren and warped. Papers littered the floor. A faint sound echoed from deeper in the mall, a faint scuffling noise. "Probably a raccoon," I whispered, though the sound made my skin crawl. As I ventured further, I found the food court, its tables overturned and scattered. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and I felt a wave of panic. I smacked it against my palm, and the light steadied. But then I heard it again shuffling, closer this time. "Hello?" My voice echoed, swallowed by the vast emptiness. The scuffling stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. I swallowed hard and pressed on, telling myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. In the center of the mall was a fountain, now dry and filled with trash. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange, a shoe lying in the debris. It looked fresh, not like it had been abandoned for years. My stomach churned, but I kept moving. I climbed the escalator, now frozen in time, its metal steps slick with grime. At the top, I reached the second level. The air felt colder up here. My flashlight picked up something glinting in a nearby store window, a camera tripod, knocked over and dusty. The tripod made me pause. Was someone filming here? My throat tightened as I noticed a trail of footprints in the dust leading into the store. They were fresh, the tread unmistakable. My heart pounded as I followed them, step by cautious step. The store was once a clothing outlet, its racks now empty and rusting. The footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the room. My flashlight swept across the floor, but there was no sign of whoever made them. A soft rustling noise came from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling. The noise stopped, leaving me staring at empty air. My mind raced. Was I imagining things? Then I noticed something in the corner, a backpack leaning against the wall. It was clean, almost new. I approached the backpack, kneeling down to inspect it. It wasn't empty. Inside, I found a notebook, a bottle of water, and a phone. The phone's screen was cracked, but the battery had power. I pressed the button to unlock it, and the screen lit up. The phone's lock screen was a photo of a young man smiling with friends. I didn't recognize him, but a cold chill ran down my spine. Whoever owned this was here recently, but where were they now? I pocketed the phone and stood up. The air grew oppressive, and I felt a prickling on the back of my neck. I turned my flashlight toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed thicker. Something moved, just barely visible, a figure retreating out of sight. My breath caught. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I stepped toward the corner, my flashlight trembling. The beam caught a glimpse of something, a handprint on the dusty wall. It was fresh. I backed away, my heart hammering. The silence pressed in around me, and I suddenly felt exposed. I needed to leave. Clutching the phone and backpack, I retraced my steps, nearly tripping on the escalator as I hurried down. The food court was eerily silent as I passed through, heading for the exit. But then I heard a low, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, but my flashlight only revealed empty space. The tapping grew louder, faster. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted for the entrance. My foot caught on debris, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the tile floor. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Don't leave." My blood turned to ice. I didn't wait to find out who or what was speaking. I bolted for the shattered doors. The cool night air hit me like a slap as I burst outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Fumbling with the keys, I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My chest heaved as I stared at the dark silhouette of the mall. Just as I started the engine, my phone buzzed. Not the phone I owned, the one I'd found. My hand shook as I pulled it from my pocket. The screen displayed a single notification. New message. My thumb hovered over the screen. I opened the message. It was a single word. Found. My heart pounded as I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I hit the gas, peeling out of the parking lot. I drove for miles, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally pulled over at a gas station, I checked the phone again. The message was gone. The photo of the young man was now replaced with a black screen. The clerk inside looked at me like I was crazy as I asked if anyone had been near my car. He shook his head, mumbling something about weirdos. I filled up the tank and got back on the road, still clutching the phone tightly. When I got home, I tossed the phone and backpack into the trash, but the unease stayed with me. Days later, I saw a missing persons report on the news. The face on the screen was the same young man from the phone's photo. My stomach turned as the news anchor explained that the young man was last seen near the Southside Mall. They mentioned the backpack too. It felt like a bad dream. But what chilled me most was the message. Found. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. I still hear faint tapping sounds in the quiet, and I can't walk past abandoned buildings without a creeping sense of dread. Some dares just aren't worth taking. Next story. The apartment was perfect on paper. A one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, affordable rent, and utilities included. It felt like the universe was finally cutting me a break. The building was older, but I didn't mind. I needed a fresh start, and this seemed like the place to get it. Moving in was uneventful. The landlord, Mr. Carson, was a gruff man in his 60s who barely said a word as he handed me the keys. "Be mindful of noise," he grunted before disappearing down the hall. I chalked it up to him being one of those old-school landlords. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the hum of the city outside, but there was nothing. No traffic, no distant sirens, just silence. It was almost unnerving how insulated the apartment felt. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to a faint sound. It was a soft scraping, like metal against wood. Groggy, I dismissed it as someone moving furniture in another unit. But as I drifted back to sleep, the sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate. The next morning, I asked Mr. Carson if there was anyone living in the unit next to mine. He gave me a strange look. "That unit's empty," he said flatly. "Has been for months?" His answer sent a small chill through me, but I didn't press him further. Over the next few days, the noises persisted. At night, I'd hear faint whispers, too muffled to make out, and that same scraping sound. I convinced myself it was just the old building settling, but a part of me started to feel uneasy. One night, I decided to investigate. The noises seemed to be coming from the wall behind my bed, which connected to the supposedly empty apartment. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to listen. What I heard made my skin crawl breathing. I jumped back, my heart racing. It wasn't loud, but it was there steady and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the hallway, stopping in front of the door to the neighboring unit. The door was locked, but something felt off. The next day, I confronted Mr. Carson. "Are you sure no one's in that unit?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, kid, that place has been empty for years. Whatever you're hearing, it's not a tenant." His answer didn't sit right with me. That night, the noises were louder. The scraping was more frantic, and the whispers sounded closer. I barely slept, clutching my phone and staring at the wall, half expecting something to burst through. I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I waited until Mr. Carson left, and then tried the door to the empty unit again. This time, it wasn't locked. My pulse quickened as I pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty space. The apartment was barren, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. Dust coated every surface, and the air felt heavy. I scanned the room with my flashlight, searching for anything that could explain the noises. Then I saw a small hole in the wall. The hole was about the size of a baseball, just above where my bed was in the adjoining unit. Peering into it made my stomach churn. The other side opened into my apartment, and the view was clear. Someone had been watching me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced. Who had made the hole, and why? I left the empty unit and returned to mine, locking the door behind me. My paranoia skyrocketed. Every creak, every sound made me jump. I barely slept that night, my thoughts spinning with possibilities. The next morning, I patched the hole with duct tape and moved my bed to the other side of the room. But the unease lingered. I felt exposed, like I was still being watched. Days passed without incident, and I started to relax. Maybe it was all in my head, but then I found the note. It was slipped under my door, written in shaky handwriting. "Stop moving things." My blood ran cold. I called the police, but when they arrived, there was little they could do. They checked the empty unit and found nothing out of the ordinary. "Probably just a prank," one of the officers said. But his words didn't reassure me. That night, I barricaded my door with furniture and kept a kitchen knife within arm's reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever left the note was still nearby, watching and waiting for the right moment. Around 3 am I woke to the sound of my doorknob rattling. My heart pounded as I grabbed the knife and stood frozen in the darkness. The rattling stopped, replaced by a soft scratching noise at the bottom of the door. I shouted, "I'm calling the cops!" The scratching stopped immediately, and the silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement. Minutes passed before I dared to move. When daylight finally came, I packed my things and left. I told Mr. Carson that I was moving out and didn't care about the lease. He didn't argue, just gave me a knowing look. "You're not the first," he muttered under his breath. As I drove away, I glanced at the building in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the window of the empty unit, watching me leave. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. Weeks later, I saw a news report about the apartment complex. A body had been discovered in one of the units, walled up in a hidden compartment. The victim was identified as a tenant who had gone missing years ago. The news anchor mentioned that the complex had a history of unexplained disappearances. The police suspected the landlord might have been involved, but they couldn't prove anything. My stomach churned as I realized how close I'd come to being another statistic. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The noises, the hole in the wall, the note, it all points to someone targeting me. I'll never know who or why, but I'm grateful I got out in time. To this day, I avoid apartments with long histories. I trust my instincts now, and I've learned to listen when something feels wrong. Sometimes, survival is about knowing when to run. Next story. The drive from Denver to Salt Lake City was supposed to be uneventful. My plan was simple: leave early, stop at a diner for lunch, and check into a motel by sunset. The endless stretch of highway seemed peaceful at first, but by noon, I realized how isolated it truly was. I passed only a handful of cars all morning. Most of the time, it was just me, the open road, and the occasional tumbleweed skittering across the asphalt. I felt a strange mixture of freedom and unease, as if I'd slipped out of the world and into some forgotten pocket of it. Around midday, I pulled into a dusty gas station in a small town that looked like it. It hadn't changed since the 1950s. The attendant was a wiry man with leathery skin and piercing eyes. "Long drive?" he asked, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "Yeah," I replied, glancing at the pump as it slowly ticked up. "Anything interesting around here?" He didn't answer immediately, just stared at the horizon. Finally, he said, "Stay on the main road. Folks get lost out here." His words lingered uncomfortably. Back on the highway, I couldn't shake the gas station attendant's tone. The landscape seemed more oppressive now, the flat plains stretching endlessly under a harsh sun. Around 2 p.m., I noticed an old car in my rearview mirror, keeping a steady distance behind me. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. There wasn't much traffic out here after all. But as the miles ticked by, the car didn't pass or fall back. It stayed there, a shadow in my mirrors, matching my speed perfectly. To test my theory, I sped up slightly. The car did the same. I slowed down, and it followed suit. A chill crept up my spine. Maybe I was overthinking it, I told myself. But the idea that I wasn't alone on this lonely highway gnawed at me. Eventually, I pulled into a rest stop, hoping to lose the car. It was a desolate place with cracked concrete picnic tables and a single vending machine. I parked and waited, pretending to stretch my legs. The car didn't stop. It continued down the road and disappeared over the horizon. Relief washed over me as I got back into my car. Maybe I'd been imagining things. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, and by sunset, I was nearing a small cluster of motels where I planned to stay the night. I checked into a rundown roadside motel and carried my bag into the room. The air conditioner rattled noisily, and the bedspread looked like it hadn't been replaced in decades. Still, it was a place to sleep. I locked the door and settled in for the night. As I lay in bed, scrolling through my phone, I heard the faint sound of tires crunching on gravel. Curious, I peeked through the curtains. My stomach dropped. The same car from earlier was parked in the lot, its headlights off, but the engine still running. I watched for what felt like an eternity. No one got out. The car just sat there, its presence an unspoken threat. Finally, I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. Should I call the front desk? The police? Or was I just being paranoid? I decided to wait it out. Maybe the driver was just resting. Hours passed, and eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up at dawn, the car was gone. I told myself it was nothing a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, I continued my drive. The highway felt even lonelier than before, and I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror constantly. By afternoon, the car was back, its headlights a distant glimmer on the horizon. This time, I didn't wait for it to get closer. I took the next exit, a narrow, unmarked road leading into the desert. My heart raced as I sped down the winding path, hoping to lose the car. For a while, I thought I'd succeeded. But then I saw it, a plume of dust rising behind me. The car was following. Panic gripped me as I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The road grew rougher, the landscape more desolate. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away. Finally, I spotted an abandoned gas station in the distance. I skidded to a stop and jumped out, running inside. The place was a wreck, broken windows, rusted shelves, and a thick layer of dust. I crouched behind the counter, struggling to catch my breath. The sound of an engine grew louder, then stopped. I heard a car door slam and footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart pounded as I peeked out. A man was standing by my car, his face obscured by a baseball cap. He looked around, then started toward the gas station. I ducked back behind the counter, clutching my phone. My hand shook as I dialed 911, but there was no signal. The footsteps grew louder, and I realized I had no plan. I just prayed he wouldn't find me. The footsteps stopped near the entrance. I held my breath, listening. After a few agonizing moments, I heard them retreat. Peeking out again, I saw the man walking back to his car. Relief flooded me as he drove away, disappearing into the desert. I waited for what felt like hours before leaving the gas station. The road ahead was unfamiliar, but I didn't care. I drove as fast as I could, putting as much distance as possible between me and that man. When I finally reached a small town, I pulled into a diner and collapsed into a booth. The waitress brought me coffee, and I told her about the man and the car. She frowned. "You're lucky. People have disappeared on those roads." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "There have been reports of a man in a car like that. He follows people, runs them off the road. Some are never found." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. "Has he been caught?" She shook her head. "Nobody knows who he is. He just vanishes." I paid my bill and left, shaken. The thought of being his next victim made my blood run cold. For the rest of my drive, I stayed on the main highways, refusing to take any detours. I didn't see the car again, but the fear lingered. Every time a vehicle appeared in my mirrors, My chest tightened. When I finally reached Salt Lake City, I parked in the hotel lot and broke down in tears. The terror of the past 2 days caught up with me all at once. I was safe now, but the experience had left a scar I'd never forget. Even now, I can't take a road trip without looking over my shoulder. I always wonder, what if he's still out there, waiting for his next target on some lonely stretch of highway? Next story. It was past midnight when my shift ended, and the city was quiet. The streets seemed darker than usual as I made my way to the parking lot. I had parked further away than I liked, but the garage had been full when I arrived earlier that evening. The streetlights flickered as I walked, their weak glow barely illuminating the cracked sidewalks. My footsteps echoed, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the street was empty. Reaching the lot, I dug my keys out of my pocket and pressed the button to unlock my car. The familiar beep was oddly comforting. I quickened my pace, eager to get home and out of the suffocating silence of the night. As I opened the door, I noticed something odd. A folded piece of paper was tucked under my windshield wiper. I hesitated before plucking it free. My heart sank as I unfolded it. In blocky, uneven handwriting, "You're being watched." My first thought was that it had to be a prank. Maybe some kids had been hanging around earlier, trying to scare people. But as I looked around, the parking lot was deserted. I climbed into my car, locking the doors instinctively. Driving home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, my paranoia mounting. Each shadow on the road seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. I turned up the radio to drown out my thoughts, but it didn't help. The paper sat crumpled on the passenger seat. When I pulled into my driveway, I stayed in the car for a moment, scanning the street. The neighborhood was eerily quiet. I grabbed the paper and got out, practically sprinting to my front door. Once inside, I double-locked the door and drew the blinds. I tossed the note into the trash, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. But as I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the unease. The words replayed in my mind. "You're being watched." It was just a joke, I told myself. It had to be. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house felt louder, more deliberate. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was just the wind. The next morning, I checked the front yard. There was no sign of anyone having been there. Relieved, I brushed off the events of the night before and headed to work. But as I got into my car, I froze. Another note was taped to the windshield. This one was shorter. "Why didn't you check?" It read. My hand shook as I held the paper. I looked around, scanning the street, but no one was there. I stuffed the note into my pocket, my mind racing. Who could be doing this? At work, I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting a message or call from the person leaving the notes. I debated telling someone, but what would I say? That I was scared of some cryptic messages? It sounded ridiculous. That night, I left work earlier, hoping to avoid the same eerie walk to the lot. The parking garage was emptier than usual, and my car was one of the last ones there. I unlocked it quickly, scanning the shadows as I slid into the driver's seat. Halfway home, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "Don't ignore me." I nearly swerved off the road. My heart pounded as I pulled over to the shoulder, staring at the message. It had to be a prank. But how did they get my number? I deleted the message, trying to calm down. When I got home, I checked every door and window, making sure they were locked. The blinds stayed shut, and I kept all the lights on. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. At lunch, I noticed someone staring at me from across the cafe, a man in a dark hoodie. When I looked back, he turned away, but I couldn't shake the feeling he was watching me. That night, I received another text. "You're making this harder than it has to be." My stomach twisted. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. I blocked it, but the unease lingered. What did they want from me? I decided to stay with a friend for the night, hoping the company would help me feel safer. As I packed the bag, my phone buzzed again. Another text from a different number. "Running won't help." I froze, the bag slipping from my hands. At my friend's house, I told her everything. She listened patiently, though I could tell she thought I was overreacting. "It's probably someone messing with you," she said. "Just ignore them." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. A new text. "I see you." My heart raced as I looked out the window. The street was empty. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump. The next morning, I found a note on my car. This one was different. It had my name on it. My hand shook as I read it. "Stop ignoring me, or you'll regret it." The realization hit me like a punch. Whoever this was, they knew who I was. I reported everything to the police, but they didn't take it seriously. "Probably just a prank," the officer said. They promised to file a report, but I could tell they weren't going to do much. I left feeling more vulnerable than ever. That night, I parked in the garage beneath my apartment building. As I stepped out of the car, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. My pulse raced as I hurried to the elevator, my keys clenched tightly in my hand. As I unlocked my apartment, I noticed something on the floor inside. A single Polaroid photograph, placed deliberately in the center of the room. It was a picture of me, taken earlier that day. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the photo was gone. I tried to explain, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. "Are you sure you didn't misplace it?" one of them asked. Frustration boiled inside me. The text stopped for a few days, and I started to think maybe it was over. But then, late one night, my phone buzzed again. A single message: "Check your closet." My blood ran cold. I stared at the closet door, paralyzed with fear. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly opened the closet. It was empty, but there was another Polaroid on the floor. This one showed me sleeping in my bed. My heart pounded as I realized whoever was doing this had been inside my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I packed the bag and left, determined to stay with my parents for a while. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road behind me remained empty. At my parents' house, I felt a little safer, but the paranoia lingered. I checked every lock, every window, convinced that whoever was tormenting me would find me. But for weeks, nothing happened. I started to think it was finally over. Then, one morning, I found a package on the front porch. There was no return address. Inside was a single item, a key. A note attached to it read, "See you soon." My hands trembled as I dropped the key, the realization hitting me. It was to my apartment. I haven't been back to the city since. I gave up my lease, changed my number, and moved to a new town. But even now, I feel like I'm being watched. Some nights, I wake up to the sound of my phone buzzing, though no messages ever appear. I've tried to move on, but the fear never leaves. Every shadow feels like it's hiding someone, every sound like it's following me. Whoever they were, they took more than just my sense of safety. They took my ability to trust. Sometimes, I wonder what they wanted. Was it just a cruel game? Or was there something darker behind it? I'll never know. All I can do is keep looking over my shoulder and hope they never find me again. But deep down, I know they're still out there, waiting. And one day, they'll find someone else to torment. I just pray that whoever it is, they'll be luckier than I was. I used to think the world was a safe place, that bad things only happen to other people. But now I know better. The world is full of shadows, and some of them are watching. Next story. The trailhead was barely marked, a faded sign leaning against a split tree. I double-checked the map on my phone. This was it, the shortcut to the campground my friend had told me about. A quicker route through the forest, or so he claimed. I adjusted my backpack, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trees. I'd started later than planned, but I figured 2 hours of hiking would get me there before dark. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding deeper into the woods. It felt like I was stepping into another world, the canopy blocking out most of the light. My boots crunched on dry leaves, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness. About 30 minutes in, I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just a faint rustle of leaves in the wind. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was normal. As I continued, the trail grew harder to follow. Branches and underbrush clawed at my legs, and the path seemed to twist in unnatural ways. My GPS struggled to load, the signal fading in and out. I told myself I wasn't lost yet. A sound broke the silence, a distant snap of a twig. I froze, my pulse quickening. Probably a deer, I muttered under my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. Something watching. I picked up the pace, my boots pounding against the uneven ground. The sun was sinking lower, the light fading faster than I expected. Shadows stretched across the trail, and every step seemed louder in the growing quiet. I stopped abruptly. There was something ahead of shape among the trees. It was motionless, but it didn't look like an animal. My chest tightened as I squinted. As I stepped closer, I realized it was a wooden structure. It was a crude shelter, barely more than a frame of branches covered in rotting tarps. Inside, I could see a pile of discarded cans, torn fabric, and something that looked like bones. Human or animal, I couldn't tell. I backed away, the hairs on my neck standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the deepening shadows. I needed to keep moving. The trail seemed different now, like it was closing in around me. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting unnaturally. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. A sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My breathing was ragged as I forced myself to keep walking, my hand gripping the small pocket knife in my bag. I tripped over a root and fell hard, my palms scraping against the dirt. As I pushed myself up, I noticed something odd, a carved symbol on the tree next to me. It was crude, almost childlike, but it looked intentional. A warning, maybe. I took a picture of the symbol with my phone, though I wasn't sure why. The signal was still out, and the battery was draining fast. The thought of being stuck out here overnight sent a wave of panic through me. The footsteps started again, this time closer. I broke into a run, the weight of my pack pulling me off balance. My heart pounded as I darted through the trees, the trail barely visible in the fading light. I stopped when I saw it, clearing up ahead. Relief washed over me as I stumbled into the open space. But my relief turned to dread as I realized the clearing wasn't natural. It was a campsite, abandoned and eerily neat. There were tents, still standing but empty, their fabric flapping slightly in the breeze. A fire pit in the center was cold, but it looked as though it had been used recently. My eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of life. On one of the tents, a name was scrawled in black marker. Miller. The same name that was on the map I downloaded. My stomach dropped as I realized this was the campground I was heading to, but there was no one here. I heard a noise behind me, a low, guttural sound that didn't seem human. I turned slowly, my whole body tense. In the fading light, I could see a figure at the edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still. The figure was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze. My mouth went dry as I backed away, my mind racing. Who or what was it? And why was it just standing there? "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head as if studying me. Then, without warning, it turned and walked into the woods. I stood frozen, unsure whether to follow or run. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but the trail out of the clearing was unclear. I checked my phone again, no signal. The last bit of sunlight disappeared, plunging the forest into darkness. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the trees. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding something. I decided to head back the way I came, hoping to find the trailhead before it got too late. As I walked, I noticed more of the carved symbols on the trees, each one more elaborate than the last. They seemed to form a pattern, but I couldn't make sense of it. My flashlight flickered, the battery struggling. A sound came from ahead, a branch snapping, followed by heavy breathing. I froze, my flashlight beam shaking as I pointed it toward the noise. The figure from the clearing stepped into view, closer this time. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I pushed through the underbrush. I could hear it following, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. My mind raced as I tried to remember the layout of the trail, but everything looked unfamiliar in the dark. I tripped again, landing hard on my side. The flashlight flew from my hand, its beam cutting out as it hit the ground. I scrambled to my feet, but before I could grab it, the figure loomed over me, silent and menacing. "Please," I shouted, backing away. To my surprise, the figure stopped, its head tilting again. It reached into its pocket and tossed something onto the ground before disappearing into the trees. I waited until I was sure it was gone before picking up the object. It was a torn piece of fabric, stained and frayed. Written on it was a single word: "Next." My hand shook as I stuffed it into my pocket and ran. By the time I found the trailhead, the sky was black and the stars offered little comfort. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. I drove all night, refusing to stop until I was miles away. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being followed. The forest may be behind me, but its shadows cling to my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I see the symbols, the figure, the word, "Next." I don't know what it meant or why it let me go. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. I tried to research the area, but there was nothing unusual about it. No legends, no missing persons, nothing. It was as if whatever happened to me was meant to stay a secret, hidden among the trees. Sometimes I wonder if it was a warning or a game. Whatever it was, I'll never forget the way it felt to be hunted, to know that something out there wanted me to see it and to remember. The forest holds its secrets well, and I was lucky to escape. But as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that my luck won't last forever. The figure wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Next story. The house at the end of Sycamore Lane had been on the market for years, its peeling paint and overgrown lawn a stark contrast to the tidy suburban homes around it. My partner and I weren't in love with it, but the price was unbeatable. "It just needs some TLC," the realtor said with a strained smile. We moved in during late summer, the neighborhood buzzing with barbecues and children on bikes. Everyone waved, but their eyes lingered on us longer than felt normal. New people don't usually last here, one older neighbor muttered before walking off. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house creaked at night, but it was old, so I didn't think much of it. I spent my days unpacking while my partner worked late. Occasionally, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but it was always just a shadow or a curtain swaying. Then came the packages. Brown paper-wrapped parcels left on our doorstep with no return address. The first was filled with old photos of our house, grainy black and white images of its construction, empty rooms, and even families we didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a quirky housewarming gift. But the second package unsettled me. It contained a stack of handwritten notes, all in different handwriting, repeating the same phrase, "Don't stay after the lights go out." When I showed my partner, he laughed it off. "Probably some bored kid in the neighborhood," he said. "You're letting this place get to you." I tried to believe him, but the notes gnawed at me, especially at night when the house seemed too quiet. One night, I stayed up late sorting through boxes when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the stairs. My heart froze. I was the only one home. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Grabbing my phone, I crept toward the stairs. They were empty, but I noticed something odd, a faint imprint on the dusty wooden step, like someone had stepped there recently. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I asked our closest neighbor, a kind woman named Rita, about the house. Her face darkened immediately. "It's not the house," she said. "It's what the people in it let happen." Before I could ask her to explain, she went back inside. That afternoon, I found another package. This one contained a single Polaroid. It showed our living room, taken at night. The curtains were drawn, but a figure stood in the corner, blurred, but unmistakably there. My stomach turned. When my partner came home, I showed him the Polaroid. His face paled. "All right, this isn't funny anymore," he said, pacing the room. We called the police, but they found nothing, no signs of entry, no footprints. "Probably a prank," the officer said. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. The house felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. At night, I'd wake up feeling like someone was in the room, but when I turned on the light, it was always empty. Always. A week later, Rita came to our door, her face drawn with worry. "You should leave," she said bluntly. "That house doesn't let people forget." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head. "You'll see." That night, I stayed up with all the lights on, determined to catch whatever was tormenting us. Around midnight, I heard the sound of the front door opening. I bolted up, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy candlestick. I crept downstairs, my breath shallow. The door was ajar, but no one was there. The air was icy, and I could hear faint whispers, too faint to make out the words. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, seeming to come from the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, and for a brief moment, I heard it clearly. "You don't belong here." I stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. My partner came rushing downstairs. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice thick with sleep. I tried to explain, but the whispers had stopped. He looked at me like I was crazy. We decided to spend the next night at a hotel. As we packed, I noticed a new package on the kitchen table. Neither of us had put it there. Inside was a single key and a note. "Lock the door, or it will open for you." Against my better judgment, I used the key to lock the front door before leaving. The house seemed to hum, like it was alive and watching us go. I didn't look back as we drove away. At the hotel, I finally felt like I could breathe again. But that night, I woke up to find the same Polaroid from before tucked under my pillow. The figure in the corner seemed closer now, almost reaching for the camera. We went back to the house the next day to pack up and leave for good. The living room smelled of earth and decay, but we couldn't find the source. The key I'd used to lock the door was sitting on the coffee table. As we carried boxes to the car, a man I didn't recognize approached us. He was tall and thin, his face gaunt. "Leaving already?" he asked, smiling faintly. Smart choice. Not everyone gets out. Before I could respond, he walked away, disappearing down the street. When I mentioned him to Rita, she looked confused. "No one new has moved here in years," she said. "Are you sure he wasn't from the house?" That evening, as we drove away for the last time, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house seemed to watch us, its windows dark and lifeless. I felt no relief, only the lingering weight of what we'd left behind. Months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to me, but had no return address. Inside was a photo of the house with the words, "Still here," scrawled across the bottom in red ink. Even now, I can't escape the feeling that the house isn't finished with me. Every night, I dream of its walls closing in, of whispers telling me to return. I haven't told my partner. Some things are better left unsaid. Sometimes, I wake up and find new photos tucked under my pillow. They're always of the house. Always from a perspective I don't recognize, as if taken by someone or something inside. I've stopped looking for answers. The house isn't just a building. It's something more, something alive and patient. And I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The house at the end of Sycamore Lane is still empty, its windows dark and unwelcoming. But sometimes I drive past it, drawn by a compulsion I can't explain. Each time, I feel it watching me. I've tried to forget, to move on, but the house won't let me. It's in my mind, my dreams, my life. It's part of me now. And I fear that one day, I'll have no choice but to go back. Next story. It started as a typical late shift at the diner. The kind where the smell of burnt coffee and greasy bacon hangs heavy in the air. I had just refilled a trucker's cup when the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped in, his coat dripping from the rain outside. The stranger looked unremarkable, at first average height, dark hair, tired eyes. He slid into the booth nearest the window, his back to me. "Coffee," he muttered without looking up. His voice was low, rough, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. I poured him a cup and placed it on the table. "Anything else?" I asked. He shook his head. When I walked back to the counter, I glanced over my shoulder. He was just sitting there, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. The hours dragged. By 2, a mirror was nearly empty. The trucker had left, and the only sound was the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. The man in the booth hadn't moved. His coffee sat untouched. It wasn't unusual for people to linger. Some were lonely, others just passing time. But there was something about this man, something still and deliberate, that unsettled me. When I approached his booth again, I noticed his hands. They were trembling. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He finally looked at me, his eyes shadowed and bloodshot. "I'm waiting," he said cryptically. "For what?" I pressed. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid the paper across the table toward me. "If anything happens," he said quietly, "read this." I didn't know what to say. My instincts screamed to walk away, but curiosity won out. "What do you mean, if anything happens?" I asked. He didn't reply. I took the paper hesitantly, but didn't open it. The man leaned back, his eyes fixed on the rain again. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "things don't turn out the way we think they will." His voice sent a chill down my spine. Minutes passed in silence. I returned to the counter, the folded paper burning a hole in my pocket. Something about him felt wrong, like he was waiting for more than just time to pass. I decided to step into the back room to call my manager. When I returned, The booth was empty. The man was gone. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. His coffee cup was still full, and on the table sat a small leather notebook. I hadn't seen him take it out. I flipped the notebook open. Inside were names, dozens of them, written in neat, precise handwriting. Some had red lines drawn through them. At the very bottom of the list was my name, circled in bold. I froze, my heart hammering. Why was my name there? I glanced around the diner, suddenly feeling exposed. The rain outside blurred the windows, but I could swear I saw movement in the shadows across the street. Gripping the notebook, I pulled out the folded paper he had given me. My hands trembled as I opened it. 4 words stared back at me. Don't leave the diner. My pulse raced. I locked the doors, unsure of what else to do. I paced behind the counter, my mind spiraling with possibilities. Was he warning me? Threatening me? My phone buzzed, startling me. It was a text from an unknown number. He's not done yet. I dropped the phone, my blood running cold. The diner was eerily silent. Even the rain seemed to have stopped. I peeked out the window, scanning the street. A figure stood under the street lamp, unmoving. It wasn't the man from the booth. This person was taller, broader. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The figure stepped into the shadows, disappearing from view. Suddenly, the phone rang, its shrill tone echoing through the empty diner. I hesitated before answering. Hello? A deep voice responded. You've been marked. The line went dead before I could speak. I stared at the receiver, my thoughts racing. Who was he? Why me? I grabbed the notebook, searching for clues, but the names meant nothing to me. The sound of a car engine brought me to the window. A black sedan idled across the street. The windows were tinted, the driver invisible. I ducked behind the counter, clutching the notebook and my phone like lifelines. After what felt like an eternity, the sedan drove off. I exhaled shakily, but my relief was short-lived. A shadow passed by the front door. Someone was out there. My fingers hovered over the police station's number. Before I could call, the power went out. The diner plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. My breathing quickened as I fumbled for the flashlight under the counter. The beam of light illuminated the booths, the counter, the kitchen door. Everything seemed normal. But then I noticed something on the window. A handprint, fresh and smeared, as if someone had pressed against the glass and slid down. The phone buzzed again. Another text. Time's up. I dropped the flashlight in panic. The being spun wildly, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. I picked it up and shone it toward the front door. It was ajar. I moved toward the door, my legs trembling. Hello? I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The street outside was empty. I closed and locked the door again, my nerves fraying with every second. When I turned back to the diner, a figure stood by the counter. My flashlight caught the edge of a rain-soaked coat before the bulb flickered out. I froze, unable to move or breathe. You didn't listen, the voice said. The figure stepped closer, his face still hidden in shadows. Why me? I stammered, clutching the notebook like a shield. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed something on the counter and turned to leave. The door shut softly behind him. I waited until I was sure he was gone before approaching the counter. A small, bloodied coin sat where he had been. My name was scratched into its surface. I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach. The lights flickered back on, and the diner felt normal again. But the coin remained, a chilling reminder that the night had been real. I locked up and left, my mind a whirlwind of questions and fear. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The coin disappeared from my pocket one day, replaced by a folded note. You're next. I haven't slept soundly since. Even now, I avoid late-night shifts. The memory of that man and his cryptic warnings haunt me. I keep the notebook hidden, afraid to destroy it, but more afraid to open it again. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but one thing is certain: I'll never forget his final words. "You didn't listen." And now, I wonder if I ever truly escaped. Next story. It started as a harmless dare. My friends and I had heard about the old Wexler textile mill on the edge of town, abandoned for decades and rumored to be unsafe. The stories were wild missing teenagers, homeless squatters disappearing, but none of us believed it. The mill loomed in the distance as we approached, its crumbling facade silhouetted against the pale moonlight. "You sure about this?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky. "It's just a building," I said, more to convince myself than her. The others laughed nervously. The main gate was chained shut, but someone had cut a gap in the fencing. We slipped through, the sharp metal edges snagging our jackets. The air smelled like rust and decay. I could already feel the chill of regret creeping in. The first floor was a maze of broken machinery and graffiti-covered walls. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing piles of rubble and rusted beams. "See? Nothing scary here," Brian said, kicking a piece of debris. His voice echoed eerily. As we moved deeper, the air grew colder. Lisa clutched my arm. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Relax," I said, though my heart was pounding. Every step seemed to stir up whispers, just the wind, I told myself. We reached a staircase leading to the upper floors. "Let's check it out," Brian suggested, already halfway up. The steps creaked under our weight. At the top, we found a long hallway lined with doors, each one hanging slightly ajar. "Why would anyone leave it like this?" Lisa asked, her voice barely audible. The rooms were empty, except for rusted bed frames and scattered papers. "Probably offices," I said, though I wasn't sure. The whole place felt wrong. Brian opened a door at the end of the hall, revealing a large room with broken windows and a collapsed ceiling. A single chair sat in the center, facing away from us. "Creepy," he said, stepping inside. I hesitated, a sense of dread washing over me. Lisa stayed close as we entered the room. Brian walked toward the chair, laughing nervously. "Think it's haunted?" he joked. He reached out to touch the chair, and suddenly, it tipped over with a loud crash. The sound made us all jump. "Don't mess around," Lisa snapped. "I didn't push it," Brian said, looking genuinely startled. The chair lay on its side, motionless. I tried to laugh it off, but my nerves were shot. "Let's keep moving," I said, eager to leave. We headed back to the hallway, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, and our footsteps seemed muffled. "Which way did we come from?" Lisa asked, panic creeping into her voice. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. Brian pointed left. "This way, I think." We followed him, but every door we passed looked the same. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. "We're going in circles," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Let's just head downstairs," I said, trying to stay calm. But when we found the staircase, it wasn't the same one we'd climbed. These steps were narrower, and they spiraled downward into total darkness. "This isn't right," Lisa muttered. "We have to try," Brian said, starting down the stairs. We followed reluctantly, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the void. The air grew damp and foul, like rotting wood and stagnant water. I gripped the railing tightly. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a vast underground room. Rusted pipes snaked along the ceiling, and puddles covered the floor. In the center of the room was a massive machine, its purpose unclear. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered. The machine hummed faintly, as if it were still alive. "No way this thing works," Brian said, stepping closer. He pressed a button on the side, and to our shock, The machine whirred to life, spitting out sparks and groaning loudly. "Turn it off," Lisa yelled, but Brian was frozen, staring at the machine. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the room, like metal striking metal. "What was that?" I shouted, spinning around. The sound came from the shadows. I pointed my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Something moved, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the light. "We need to go," Lisa said, tugging on my arm. I didn't argue. As we turned to leave, the machine let out a deafening screech and shut down. The room plunged into silence, broken only by our ragged breathing. The shadows seemed to close in, pressing against the edges of our flashlights. We scrambled back up the stairs, our footsteps echoing loudly. When we reached the top, the hallway was gone. Instead, we stood in a massive open space, filled with rows of machinery stretching endlessly in every direction. "This isn't possible," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "It's like the building is changing." Brian's face was pale. "We have to find the exit," he said, his confidence gone. We picked a direction and started walking, our flashlights barely illuminating the path. The machines loomed around us, their rusted frames like skeletal remains. Strange noises echoed in the distance, clanking, whispering, and something else, a low, rhythmic thumping. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped my flashlight. We came to a door, the first we'd seen in what felt like hours. It was heavy and rusted, but we managed to force it open. On the other side was a narrow tunnel, lit by flickering overhead lights. "This has to lead somewhere," I said. We hurried through the tunnel, the lights buzzing faintly. The walls were lined with strange symbols, scratched into the metal like warnings. "What is this place?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. None of us had an answer. At the end of the tunnel, we found another staircase, this one leading upward. Hope surged as we climbed, the thought of escape driving us forward. But when we reached the top, we were back in the first hallway, the doors still ajar. "No," Lisa said, her voice cracking. "This can't be happening." Brian punched the wall in frustration. "We're trapped," he yelled. I took a deep breath, trying to think. "There has to be a way out," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We retraced our steps, searching for anything we'd missed. Then, Lisa screamed. I turned and saw her pointing at a window. Outside, the sky was pitch black, devoid of stars or moonlight. It was as if the building had swallowed us completely. Desperation set in. We split up, each of us searching a different hallway. I could hear Brian shouting in the distance, his voice echoing strangely. Then, silence. "Brian?" I called out, but there was no response. I found Lisa huddled in a corner, tears streaming down her face. "He's gone," she whispered. "We have to leave him." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew she was right. We had to focus on getting out. Finally, we found a door marked Exit. It looked too good to be true, but we had no choice. We pushed it open and stumbled outside, into the cold night air. The mill stood behind us, silent and unchanging. We didn't speak as we walked back to the car. Brian was gone, and we had no explanation for what had happened. The stories about the mill were true, but the truth was far worse than we could have imagined. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mill's windows glinted faintly in the moonlight, like watching eyes. I swore I saw a figure standing in the doorway, but when I looked again, it was gone. Lisa and I never talked about what happened that night. We told Brian's parents that he'd gone hiking and never returned. They held a memorial for him, but I couldn't bring myself to attend. The guilt was too much. Even now, I can't drive past the mill without feeling a chill. Sometimes I think I hear faint whispers when I'm alone. Other times I see shadows moving at the edge of my vision. The mill hasn't let us go. I know I should tell someone the truth, but who would believe me? All I know is that we were lucky to get out alive. Whatever's inside the Wexler mill, it's still there, waiting for its next visitors.